Hi, I'm Wendy Gardner, and today I'm going to show you what you can do with this really lovely garland panel by Makower fabrics. Once it's all unravelled, you have a 115cm wide panel with 32 little motifs in 4 different styles and colours. And you can do quite a lot with these, from making cushion cover appliques to wreaths to coasters and more. But let me show you some quick and easy methods of putting them together. The first step is to cut out the little motifs, but don't try and cut them out neatly all the way around. Just cut out a rectangle around them, because it's actually easier to sew them together and then cut them out. So here's one I've cut out ready. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make this into a little sweet smelling hanger. So I'm going to put on the loop. So it's a little loop of ribbon, about 10 centimetres long. And I pin it in place where I want the hanger to be. And I'm just going to stitch that in place around here before then putting the 2 pieces together. And so that I can see the outline here, I'm going to then stitch around from this angle. But first things first, let's anchor that hanger in place. A little loop is now anchored in place with some stitch, and note that the loop is actually down towards the bird. I'm now going to add the backing fabric, right sides together, flip it over because I want to be able to see the outline, and I'm also going to pin a little turning gap so that I don't forget to leave it, because once I get going I can so easily forget to leave a gap. I need to leave a gap to turn it through and to stuff. So I'm just going to double pin that tells me to stop there, and then I'm going to stitch around the outside. It's really that simple. So there he is, stitched all the way around the outer edge with the turning gap. And don't forget I had right sides together, so now it's at this point that I can trim it down. I'm cutting out, leaving about 1/4 inch or 6mm for seam allowance. And the next thing to do is to clip into the seam allowance so that it will turn through nicely and lay nice and flat. So it's close to the stitching but not through the stitching, obviously. And I actually clip at an angle so that it prevents any fraying. You can turn it through the little hole we left. And do remember to backstitch at the start and finish of the sewing so that when you're turning it through, you're not unravelling that stitching. And this is when a point turner comes into its own, because I can use it to push out my little bird. And once you've pushed him all out, it's time to give a good press, which makes so much difference. Once it's been nicely pressed flat, it's time to stuff, a little at a time. I'm just going to put a little bit in, and then I can use an end of a pencil or pen to push it up into the beak and to the tail. I'm now just slip stitching the opening close by hand, just pulling those edges together, keeping it all inside. So there's my little dove finished with its little hanging loop on the outside. But there's a quicker way of putting these together. This time I'm going to put my hanging loop onto the wrong side, because I'm going to sew my 2 pieces with the wrong sides together, sew around the inner edge, and then pink it. Let me show you what I mean. Here it is all stitched and ready with the little turning gap again. So I've made a little funnel out of paper. I'm just going to poke that into my gap, so I can add a little bit of dried lavender. And once I've got a little bit in, just a couple of teaspoons really is all you need, I can then add stuffing. So that's lightly stuffed. I'm going to machine sew that last little gap and then trim. That's another one done, lovely, quick and easy. And now I'm going to do the star. Now with the star, it's actually quite difficult to leave a reasonable size turning gap because of the short edges. So for this one, I stitch all the way around the edge and then cut a slit in the back. I'll show you what I mean. As I get to the angle here, I stop with the needle down, raise the presser foot and pivot the fabric, and then presser foot down, off you go again. Same when we get to the point, just do that last stitch, pivot and down. So remember, this time I'm not leaving a turning gap, just cutting out all the way around. When I get to the points, I'm just going to angle in, so I'll minimise the amount of fabric in the seam allowance, and at the inner points snip inwards. And now, because I've stitched all the way round, I need to create a turning gap in the back. So I'm just going to, I've pulled it away from the front, take a little slit with my quick unpick and then cut a little slash into the back there so that I can turn it through. If you use a point turner, you can push out the points nicely, and of course a good press before we stuff the back. My little star's lovely and stuffed, so I'm just closing up the gap in the back. So I've tucked in the raw edges and pinned the two edges together, and I'm just over edging along to keep it together. So he's all healed up now, but if I want a hanging loop, this time I will stitch it to the outside, to the back, and then just holding it in place, I can just stitch it to the back of the little star. Number 3 down. Now the next one I'm going to do, I want to sew as a coaster. So this time what I have, I've got the fabrics right sides together, but I've backed it with some wadding, which will give some heat protection on the table. Just going round the outside, and I'm coming to my double pins to remind me to leave that turning gap. Just trimming, leaving about 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way round. And then, as before, because it's a curved seam, I'm just snipping into, close to, but not through the stitching, but at an angle to prevent the seam allowance from fraying. Having trimmed all the way round, I can now turn it through. So inside there, the wadding's on the back, but when I turn it through, the wadding goes onto the inside as well. So I've machine stitched along the design to anchor the layers together, so that's a coaster finished. Of course, you could add some more decoration. You could put on some little glass beads. These are fixed with a hot gun, or sequins, or other little beading, or you could just use hand-stitched French knots. How you decorate is entirely up to you, of course. So that's another one done. The next one I'm going to do is I'm going to do the little bird again, but this time I'm going to stitch around the inner edge. So whether you use the inner edge as your stitching line or the outer edge is entirely up to you. But I want to show you sort of how much smaller the little bird looks when you stitch around the inner edge. First job is to anchor the loop, of course, and then right sides together, stitch around the whole piece. So before I start sewing, because the fabric is quite light and the design is quite light this time, it's a pale gold colour, I've actually marked my stitching line with a fade away marking pen, so it's nice and easy to see on the sewing machine. The process of stitching, cutting, turning and stuffing is exactly the same as the first bird that I sewed. There's my little bird finished, and this was the original size. So you can see it's a little bit smaller, and this size is really cute for Christmas tree decorations, whereas this is great for bunting or garlands. And the same again with the star, my little one and my big one. So the last method of sewing these lovely little motifs that I'm going to show you, and I'm sure you'll find something else to do with them as well, is I'm going to use it for applique. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew the panel, the little shape, to some fusible interfacing with the glue side down towards the right side of the fabric. I'm going to sew all around the outer edge, and then pulling it away, I can take a little cut into the interfacing to turn it through, and what I'll have then is a beautifully turned edge, just like needle turned applique. Very quick and easy though. So I've trimmed it all the way around, having sewn all the way around, and I'm just going to cut a slip into the interfacing, just so that I can turn it around, exactly the same way as if I'd had a different fabric on the back. But of course I can't press it until I know where it's going to be, because the glue side is now uppermost here. And of course once I start pressing, that will anchor it in place. So I hope you like those few ideas of what you can do with the Makower garland panel. I decided to put the little dove here on the back of this cushion, and I also covered some self-covered buttons with another bit of the fabric that was left over from that panel. So lots of things you can do. Enjoy. Bye for now.